Hello to another edition of My Haunted Life 2, brought to you by G. Michael Vasey. And for this episode I'm going to go back to my very first book, in which I described some of my own experiences growing up with ghosts and poltergeists and strange occurrences. So listen in now as I read for you 3 stories from My Haunted Life, the first book I ever wrote about ghosts and ghoulies. The Last Supper. I was at the beginning of my second year of college. I moved into a flat in West Bromwich, near Birmingham. It was quite a distance from the university, but it was the only thing I could find that I could actually afford. There was a bus ride into Birmingham, and so I just had to get used to the idea of commuting. At some point, I had acquired a very large paper poster of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. I really liked the painting and would often spend time studying the details of the picture. It hung proudly on the main wall of the flat. One evening I went out and ended up at a party. I met a girl there who was an art student. We got talking and I mentioned that I wrote poetry and song lyrics. She talked to me about how she was expected to paint and create a group of art items around a theme for a project. Somehow we arrived at the idea that perhaps she would use my poetry for that. The only thing left to do was for her to review the poems, so we made arrangements for her to visit the following Saturday afternoon. On Saturday afternoon, I tried to tidy and clean the flat. I was quite keen to impress her, if the truth be told. I even went out and bought a few small cakes from the bakery and spent a small fortune on some decent instant coffee. She duly arrived and she sat opposite me across a small table. In between munching on the cakes, she began to read some of my poetry. At once, she spotted the theme that we had discussed and that had initially piqued her interest: fear, ghosts, astral plane, magic, and so on. "Why do you write so many on that set of topics?" she asked. I tried to do my best to explain. I told her about the Cavalier ghost from my childhood, the activities at my house growing up that had followed me to West Bromwich, about my interest in understanding it all and my avid reading of books on magic, the esoteric, and the occult. She laughed. "That's a load of bloody nonsense," she giggled. To be honest, I was a bit angered by that reaction. She sat there, reading my innermost secrets in those poems, and when I explained what motivated them, she laughed. "No, it isn't nonsense. Not at all," I said firmly. "Of course it is. There are no such thing as ghosts," she said matter-of-factly. "Magic is something done on stage by people using trickery." "No, you're wrong. Prove it," she said. Those 2 words, prove it. Damn it, I would try. I was pretty angry at having my intelligence questioned and being insulted by a person who plainly had never experienced anything at all unusual. Prove it, indeed. I began mentally repeating the words. Make something happen. Prove it to her. I really didn't expect anything to happen, to be honest. I'd not really ever tried to make something happen, as honestly I was too scared of what might occur if I was successful. Anger and indignation, pride and ego this time, however, motivated me to try. There was no technique, no magic words, just a deep-seated will driven by anger to make her eat those words. "I will," I said forcefully. To my utter amazement, the windows behind me suddenly rattled, and with a loud cracking noise blew wide open. A rush of air entered the flat. blowing her hair back and scattering the pile of poems all around the room. Her eyes, probably like mine, widened in total shock and awe. Then, the pièce de résistance, the huge paper Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper picture, pinned to the wall with pins, suddenly billowed off from that wall behind her, passed over her head, and landed on the coffee table in front of her. It actually flew against the wind from the window to get there. There was a moment's silence as she surveyed and computed what had just occurred. White as a sheet, she leapt to her feet, clutched her belongings and ran out of the door. I never saw her again. I too was shocked. Actually, scared silly might be more accurate. I really don't know what happened that afternoon. Did I really cause that to happen? Or was it simply just a freakish coincidence that at the moment I willed something to happen, a strong wind blew open the windows of the flat? It had never happened before, and it never happened again. I guess I'll never know. It was, however, a long time before I ever tried to work magic again. The Voice. It was the summer of 1981. Bryan Adams was playing on the radio. The sun was shining and I was driving a brand new Ford Mustang. I was in Nova Scotia, Canada, where I was doing my first season of field work for my PhD thesis. Things could not be better. I had applied to a couple of PhD programs earlier that summer. The one at Strathclyde University in conjunction with the British Geological Survey in Leeds was the one I wanted for all sorts of reasons. Firstly, it involved travelling to Nova Scotia. Secondly, it was a topic that interested me. And finally, I thought, unlike many others that seemed designed to turn you into a university academic, this one might actually help me get a job. Even the trip for the interview had been fun, as I left my parents caravanning with my brothers somewhere deep in the Yorkshire Dales and jumped on a train to Glasgow. Back in 1981 this was still major travel and I revelled in travelling. Professor P. McCall Donald Duff seemed a nice man and we got along very well. I had a funny feeling I'd get the gig, and I did, with one proviso: I needed a driving licence, since otherwise getting about in Nova Scotia may well prove to be a serious issue. Back at home, my father patiently instructed me in driving the Mark I Ford Cortina he had purchased especially for the purpose, although I do think he liked the car too. I vividly recall the end of one lesson in which I'd done quite well, and as it pulled up outside the house, Dad invited me to drive into the driveway. I tried. I really did. I took half the front brick wall with me, and later that night listened guiltily from my bedroom as my father hammered the car back into some semblance of shape. My driving test was booked, and there would be enough time to take a second attempt if necessary before my adventure to Nova Scotia began. I had a couple of proper lessons with a trained instructor, and he agreed that I was ready. Fingers crossed then. The problem as I now look back was opting to use the Ford Cortina to take the test. It was old, and it looked old. It was also sluggish to take off. I drove well, but still failed the test due to undue hesitation. I was never sure whether it was me or the car that caused that, but yes, knowing the car, I was very careful pulling out into the main road. My second attempt was scheduled already, and I decided to use the much newer vehicle provided by my professional driving instructor. It was a good decision, and I drove straight through the test into a spanking new driver's license. I was now qualified to start the PhD fieldwork. I took the train to London lugging a huge suitcase. I then took the tube to Heathrow and was really terrified I wouldn't make it on time. Of course I did. I do not recall what sort of plane it was, but it had a standing bar at the front where you could drink and smoke. Bizarre. I'd never flown before, and as the wheels left the ground, I wasn't sure if I really liked it either. A couple of gin and tonics later, though, and I decided that I did. I was met on arrival by the prof and his wife, and for the first week or so he drove me around. At the end of that period, we went to the rental company and I rented my car. A brand new red Ford Escort. I couldn't believe it. I mean, what could possibly get better? Nova Scotia, brand new car, and a whole world to explore. The Escort lasted a day. On my first day on my own, I stopped for lunch at a burger joint. It had a front car park, and I pulled up, parked, put on the handbrake, got out, closed the door, and stood watching as the car rolled slowly forwards and then down a 4-foot drop into the front garden of the house next door. Apparently in an automatic you're supposed to leave it in park, not neutral, and everyone knows that handbrakes are useless in automatic vehicles, I was later told. Was it a premonition of things to come? So now you know how I ended up driving a 2-litre Mustang down a grit road in Nova Scotia. The only replacement they could offer was that beauty, and let me tell you, it was a beauty. It went very well, and it looked great. Off the main roads in Nova Scotia, at least back then, the roads are gravel and grit. So there I was, driving a beast of a car down a gravel road, Bryan Adams full blast on the radio, the sun streaming through the retractable top, enjoying every second of this freedom. I was going very fast. Very, very fast indeed. Why not? It was fun. "Gary, slow down!" said a voice behind me. I swiveled around. The hairs on the back of my neck had jumped to attention, and my heart was beating like crazy. There was no one there. I slowed instinctively anyway, since I was, as you might expect, very puzzled and just a little scared. "Slow down!" said the voice again, louder this time. I hit the brakes quite hard in surprise and started to slow down abruptly. The tyres spun in the gravel and the car started to drift into a skid. I stared into it and around the hairpin bend that suddenly appeared in front of me. I just made it around that bend with one wheel hanging over the edge momentarily before the skid ended and the tyres engaged again, pulling me to safety. "Told you," said the voice behind me. I stopped. I was shaking like a leaf. After a while I got out, lit a cigarette with shaking hands and went back to the hairpin bend. It was a sheer drop, perhaps 40 or 50 feet into a lake below. There'd been no road sign, no warning, except for that voice. Had it not been for that voice, I would surely have been dead or badly injured in the lake below. I think I looked like a ghost. What or whoever that miraculous voice was, I will never know, but it saved my life. Poltergeist. Growing up in my house was, on the whole, pretty good. We had great parents. Almost every weekend we were gone camping somewhere. We had 2 proper holidays each year, and I've no complaint at all. Just a bunch of heartfelt thanks to my parents and a growing sense of awe as to how they did all that with 3 small boys and not a lot of money. When I was 11 we moved. It was a good move, to be honest, from a terraced 3 up 2 down in West Hull to a rather nice semi-detached outside of Hull. It meant a better school and a nicer environment back then. It stretched my parents' finances a bit too. It is funny though that my brothers and I really did not like that house the very first time we saw it. It had terrible wallpapers. It was gloomy and ill-lit, very cold and damp without central heating. Between the 3 of us there was no excitement at moving there. Of course, within a few months, that house was completely different. Central heating had been installed, old fireplaces blocked up and replaced with modern gas fires, new wallpapers and decor and curtains. To make it seem more homely, a couple of internal windows had even been added, letting much more light enter into the rooms as well. It was transformed. All was well in the Vasey household, but it wasn't to stay that way. The first incident was seeing the Cavalier ghost, and after that I swapped rooms with my little brother, giving me the smallest bedroom at the front of the house, but also the privacy of my own room. I gradually came to loathe that room. It started with the noises. Strange noises at all times of day, but mostly in the dead of night. Scraping and scratching sounds. Dad put it down to maybe a squirrel in the loft. I wasn't as convinced. Things would also move around. I would place my watch by the bathroom sink to get washed and find it in the kitchen. At first, I thought it was Dad having fun, as he was always a great practical joker. But soon, it became apparent that it was not him. Keys went missing. Money too. These would then just as mysteriously turn up in the strangest places, like on a window ledge or under the sofa cushions. The next developments were what eventually had me relieved to leave and go to college. It was what kept me awake at night in total fear. Have you noticed that silence is loud? I mean, when you are really, really focusing on listening to nothing, it is very, very loud. I would lie in bed, head under the bedclothes, bedside light on, listening. The scratching sounds, the sounds of doors opening that I knew were locked, the sounds of footsteps and breathing. It was enough to make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. I would dread coming home from college for a weekend or the summer because of this. By the way, this only happened when I was there. Just for me, apparently. I would literally go out and get drunk in order to stay there. The best example was one night close to Christmas. I was home from college and had been out with my friend and had had a few. I was sleeping on the floor in my brother's room that night. I lay down, hoping to pass right out, but instead I was stone cold sober and scared half to death by the sound of the front door opening. Now the first thing I thought was that somehow I'd left the door unlocked. But I knew that this wasn't the case, as I had checked it on the way up the stairs. The key was in the lock, and that door was locked. The front door opened and closed as I listened, sitting half up in bed. There was a deep sigh and a little cough. Ice-cold fear ran through my veins. The silence was so loud, it was unbearable. Then, the first footstep and creak of the bottom stair. My heart was beating as if to burst. Another long sigh, and another step, and another, and another. I was now fumbling for the light, but my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't find it. By now the steps seemed to be at the top of the stairs and moving along the hallway. The floorboards creaked, and there was that sigh again. I was frozen to the spot. But what I actually wanted to do was run anywhere. There was a moment's silence. And then I watched in disbelief and horror as the bedroom door began to swing slowly open. I screamed. I screamed so loudly you probably heard me in London. A few moments passed by and then the door flew open. There, to my utter relief, stood my dad in his pyjamas, holding a very large spanner in one hand and a flashlight in the other. He switched on the light and my brother looked about him in a state of shock through 2 sleepy-looking eyes. "It's okay, I heard that too," said my dad. "I heard it too." We sat, Dad, my brother and I, for quite a while, but all was quiet. Whatever it was, it had gone. I eventually fell asleep, and my dad went back to bed, checking the doors in the process. We didn't talk about it much the next day. It was simply something that happened in the house when I was home. My dad said it was poltergeist activity and it was centered around me. I think he was right. We didn't really know what to do about it, but we did discover one thing. If I got angry, the phenomena stopped. So that is what I would do. I'd get angry and shout at whatever it was to get lost, or perhaps use even more choice phrases. If a door started to open, instead of screaming, I pulled the door open with a verbal challenge. It had the desired effect. The activity followed me, though. It followed me to university. But that is another story. Thank you for listening to this episode of My Haunted Life 2. Please do share your stories of the paranormal at the website myhauntedlife2.com. Please do share, like and follow this podcast. And if you like the stories, perhaps you'd buy the book My Haunted Life by G. Michael Vasey. Good night.